It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the green space today, our cozy little theater here on the ground floor, facing Varick Street at WNYC on the second day of President's Week, 2 days before George Washington's actual birthday. Little history, Washington's birthday got moved to the third Monday in February in 1971, if you didn't know that, under the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, the better for the ski vacation industry, I guess. In fact, other vacation and shopping industries too. Memorial Day, Labor Day, Columbus Day, and Martin Luther King's birthday, once it was created, are all included in this. Exempt are the 4th of July, because it would be weird to celebrate a holiday called the 4th of July and like the 2nd of July or the 5th of July. Also Veterans Day, out of respect, always November 11th for the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and Christmas and New Year's. And for President's Week, as opposed to President's Day, some school districts have it, some don't. I think it's a function of teachers' union collective bargaining agreements in New York City and some other places, and how the unions and the districts most wanted to distribute school days and days off from school. So here we are. I know some of you listening today have President's Week. Some of you just had President's Day. Now, we know George Washington was good at many things: being a general, being a president, admitting to his parents that Russia chopped down his cherry tree. Well, not exactly, but he didn't say crooked Alexander Hamilton chopped down the cherry tree or the FBI chopped down the cherry tree. And in fact, there's an article this week by Thomas Pickering and James Stoutenberg about something else you may not have realized Washington was good at. The article is headlined, "Did George Washington Predict Donald Trump?" And I'll read you a few excerpts. It says, in September 1796, George Washington, weary of partisan combat just 8 years after the ratification of the Constitution and the founding of the nation, wrote a farewell address explaining why he would not seek a third term. His message is worth remembering in our current political moment. And a paragraph later, it says, he foresaw the possibility of foreign influence over our political system and the rise of a president whose ego and avarice would transcend the national interest, raising the threat of despotism. It says Washington certainly had great confidence, but in his address, he didn't brag about his accomplishments. On the contrary, he beseeched the Almighty to soften the impact of his errors and expressed hopes that the country would forgive them. He established a standard for presidential self-deprecation out of the fear that a president of grossly inflated ego could become a threat to democracy. Then a little later it says, some of Washington's most prescient warnings were about the dangers of factionalism. He wrote that should one group, quote, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, gain domination over another, the result could be, quote, a more formal and permanent despotism. He said the despot's rise would be fueled by disorders and miseries that would gradually push citizens, quote, to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able and more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. George Washington said that in 1796. And as if envisioning the political tribalism and 24/7 cable news culture of today, he even urged political leaders to restrain, quote, the continuous mischiefs of political parties. The spirit of party, he wrote, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. And I'll conclude this with the part of the article that says, and then Washington arrived at one of his greatest concerns, the ways in which hyperpartisanship could open the door, quote, to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Wow, George Washington's own words. Farsighted indeed, right? And with that, here we are on February 20th, 2018. My first guest today is also concerned with the common good. In fact, that's the name of the new book by former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich, long identified with progressive politics and progressive economics. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter in the Democratic primaries in 2016. And even as the Trump tax law is becoming a little more popular, according to the latest polls, Reich reminds us on his Twitter feed that since that law took effect, stock buybacks have surged to $88 billion compared to what he calls the paltry $2.5 billion of employee bonuses that corporations say they'll give out, revealing the bonuses for what they are, a fig leaf to disguise the big buybacks. Robert Reich is also a policy professor at UC Berkeley, and The Common Good is his 15th book. And with that, please welcome Robert Reich to the Green Space. Nice to see you in person. Thank you for coming.
Well, Brian, it's nice to see you in person. And also, what a change from the times we've talked before. You have a real people here.
Real people, human
real
beings.
People.
Well, you don't know.
It's nice to see all of you.
They may be androids, but can we start on some news and then go to the book? Sure enough, there's an article in the Times today that says the tax bill is becoming more popular. Though, to not mislead people about what that means, it's gone from 90% unpopular among Democrats down to 80% unpopular. But still, it seems to coincide with a shrinking Democratic advantage in the generic question, who do you want to control Congress next year, and a few-point uptick in Trump's own favorability ratings. How do you see the tax law economically and politically?
Well, there's no question, Brian, that the tax law is a huge giveaway to big corporations and the wealthy. And it's not just my opinion. Almost every study that's been done, bipartisan, nonpartisan, has come up with exactly the same reality. This was sold to the American people, however, as a big tax break for the middle class and for the working class. It's a lie. And the question that I come back to, and the question underlying my book, is how do you deal with lies? How do you deal with a kind of a president and a Fox News propaganda machine that will continue to tell the public the opposite of what actually is, tax law being one obvious example?
Your tweet about buybacks versus bonuses, can you elaborate on that?
Buybacks, stock buybacks, are not new. They were legalized in 1982 by Ronald Reagan's Securities and Exchange Commission, basically a device to, it's kind of like using steroids to create an artificial impression that stocks are in demand. So companies buy back their own stocks, create the impression of demand, that drives stock prices higher. Again, temporarily, it feels good temporarily. It's good for CEOs whose stock buy their stocks. A lot of what they are paid is in stocks and stock options. But it does nothing for the underlying company. This company's not investing in research and development. It's not investing in new plant or equipment. It's certainly not investing in its workers. And yet that was the idea, and that was the selling point behind the big new tax cut for corporations, that suddenly they're going to take all this money, not buy back their own stock, but actually invest it.
Your tweet suggests, I guess that suggests there's something wrong with buybacks. I've seen it, the buyback portrayed also as just a sign of confidence by companies that the economy is going to grow, that their stocks are going to grow.
Well, if it's a sign of confidence that by companies, then what the companies are doing, then you've got to ask, well, why are companies essentially telling some of their shareholders to sell their shares of stock to the company? I mean, there's a little bit of duplicity involved in that from the beginning. But more importantly, I think it reveals a misunderstanding about what drives economic growth and what drives investment. Essentially, the only way you get companies to invest in R&D, in workers, in their plant and equipment is if they think that they are going to have more customers in the future. And that only happens if there are likely to be more customers, if people in our great middle class and working class and poor have more money in their pockets to turn around and buy stuff. But if we have a shrinking middle class, as we have had for at least 2 decades or more, and if we have a working class and poor that are less and less able to turn around and buy anything, then there is a crisis of aggregate demand. That is, companies rationally are not going to invest, and that's exactly what's happened.
Are you worried at all about this? Here's an article from today by Greg David. Maybe you know him. He writes about economics nationally and locally a lot for Crane's New York Business here in New York. Headline, Cuomo says Trump tax law hurts, but my paycheck just grew. Subhead, Republicans intend to portray Democrats' criticism as rhetoric. And he writes, my paycheck went up 4.4% last week, the most it has increased this decade. Did your take-home pay go up? And then he goes on to say how even calculating for whatever he's going to lose in terms of his state and local tax deduction on his federal taxes by being a New Yorker, he's still going to wind up with a net plus. And so are you concerned at all that the Republicans will successfully portray the Democrats' criticism of the tax bill as rhetoric once people see what's actually in their paychecks?
Well, I think there's certainly room for concern about that, because what the Republicans have done very cleverly is to front load the tax bill so that all the benefits are there in the first year and second year, and then gradually they are eroded. Most people start losing ground in terms of the taxes that they pay. They have got to pay more and more, that is. More and more of the tax cut goes to the wealthy over time. And yet people initially feel that they're doing better. Also, withholding taxes and the withholding tables are designed so people are getting kind of more benefits than they think, than they actually are. I mean, it's kind of a false withholding of a minimal withholding of taxes to begin in the beginning. So all of this means that people are being duped. And the question again is, when will people discover what the truth is?
Just one more thing on this, about the deficits this tax cut is projected to incur. Do both parties just go back and forth on this, depending on who's in power? As recently as October 2015, you posted a video called Austerity 101, the 3 reasons Republican deficit hawks are wrong. Now it seems like the Democrats are the deficit hawks. So were deficit hawks wrong in 2015 but are right today?
The 3 reasons that I posted for why deficit hawks are wrong, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, are still valid. That is, if the deficit as a percentage of the total economy is declining, as a percentage of the economy, even though in absolute terms it might be going up, then we shouldn't worry. It's only when the deficit as a percentage of the economy keeps going up, that's the time to worry. Secondly, when the deficit is spent on things like research and development or education or job training or infrastructure, that may grow the economy, which means the deficit as a proportion of the economy will continue to shrink. That's not bad, that's good. It's only when the deficits are used for things like, for example, a gigantic tax cut for the wealthy, that you have to worry, because it's not going to grow the economy. Trickle-down economics is, let me be very clear about this, a cruel joke. It does not work. We've tried it before. It's one of those few economic theories that have been tried and have been shown to be absolutely wrong.
And the buybacks are an example of that, because the people who are getting the benefits from the law find a way to concentrate the wealth among themselves?
Of course. Well, the corporate buybacks, using profits for buybacks, artificially creating an uptick in shares of stock, or at least preventing stocks from declining as much as they otherwise would, helps mostly people who own shares of stock. And as we now know, and a lot of good research has now been done on this, and that is the richest 1% of Americans own 40% of all shares of stock. The richest 10% of Americans own 80% of all shares of stock. So obviously, as the stock market is artificially kept up with profits that are generated in part by a tax cut, that's another way in which the wealthy members of our society get a big benefit.
Listeners, my guest, if you want to call in and talk to him, is former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich, whose new book is called The Common Good. By the way, I'll mention that you can see Robert Reich in person tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side, Broadway and 82nd Street. That's Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, Barnes & Noble, Upper West Side. Those of you here in our audience at the Green Space, if you have a question for Robert Reich, you can raise your hands. We'll come around. And anybody listening, you can call in, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. By the way, I neglected to mention, as we usually do at the beginning of Green Space shows, that you can not only listen to the show when we're in the Green Space, you can also watch, because we have a live video stream from here. So you can go to thegreenspace.org, or you can go to the WNYC Facebook page. Either of those, the Green Space, that's green with an E at the end of it, so the green space.org, or to the WNYC Facebook page, and you can find the live stream, and I'll wave hello to you. All right, The Common Good. Name of the book is The Common Good. You identify 3 structural breakdowns leading to the politics of today. And on the first one, you and George Washington definitely agree. A politics defined by whatever it takes to win. You don't think it was always like this?
At various points, it has been like this, Brian, but we've had periods of reform in which we've said, essentially, as a nation, that our politics has got to be serious about the common good. We've got to make sure that there's not too much money in politics. We did this for the first time in the 1840s. We did it again in the first decade of the 20th century, the progressive era. We did it again right after Watergate. We've kept big money out of politics. We have to go back. We've got to do it again. Big money is now infecting our politics as never before. We also have got to reaffirm, it seems to me, that the whatever it takes mentality, whether we're talking about politics or even the profitability of companies or even individuals, if it's leaders who are saying essentially, my only responsibility is to get more wealth or more power for my company or for myself or for my political party, they are violating a public trust. That the most essential, basic public trust is the country as a whole, the world as a whole. That is the public good. Now, it may sound odd and quaint and a little corny to say it, and that just shows how far we've come from the days when we used to talk about the common good. But it is not. We've got to revive that kind of language, and we've got to revive that kind of discussion.
You trace this back somewhat to Watergate and the Robert Bork confirmation hearings as 2 of the relatively recent posts. Now, one way to look at those moments is that Democrats were the aggressors against the party in power in those instances, against Nixon, against Bork. Are you blaming your own party for starting it in the modern era to any degree?
I think the blame really is everywhere. I don't think it is fair to blame Democrats or Republicans. By the way, I'm not kind of making a false equivalence. I do think that the Democrats have been overall more responsible than the Republicans. But having said that, let me also say that since the 1980s, the Democrats have been drinking out of the same political financial trough as the Republicans in terms of big money. Big money from corporations, big money from Wall Street, and that has undermined the integrity of the Democratic Party as a voice of working class people, as a voice of middle class and poor people. I remember, and some people just looking at some of the people who are sitting here today might also remember, not accusing anybody of looking my age, but I'm just saying you might also remember a time in our history after the Second World War, that first 3 decades, when we seriously were worried about the common good. There was an anti-Vietnam War movement. There was a civil rights movement. There was a feminist movement. But beyond that, we also had political action. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Environmental Protection Act, Medicare, Medicaid. We took seriously these ideals that were part of the common good. I'm not suggesting we achieved them, but part of what is, I think, admirable about America is particularly the points in time when we sought to achieve these ideals. Not that we achieved them, but we tried. And I worry that we are not even trying any longer.
You bring up history that some people alive today might remember, and I'm curious about your own take now on the 90s and hyperpartisanship at that time when you were in office as labor secretary under President Clinton. There was, as I recall it, this irrational, character-assassinating anti-Clintonism that sprung up, accusing him of everything from treason for avoiding Vietnam to murder, and not just of Vince Foster. There were people raising other alleged incidents, and arguably the first modern Trump-like figure to really rise to power, Newt Gingrich, became Speaker of the House. And they took Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky all the way to impeachment, as you know, as a hyper-partisan attack. Are things worse today?
I think they are worse today. They're worse today partly because that hyperpartisanship has been institutionalized. You know, you get a Speaker of the House who says his primary goal is to prevent the President of the United States from having a second term. I mean, that can't and should never be the primary goal of the Speaker of the House. The primary goal of people who are in politics ought to be the good of the nation. The consistent, repeated putting the party before the public, the notion that basically politics is a blood sport, that there are no institutional norms, that trust in the institutions of our democracy is no longer important. That to me is, having been institutionalized since Newt Gingrich, and I will say Newt Gingrich, to me, was the big beginning of all of that. It's been institutionalized to a point where it's now taken for granted. And it wasn't always that way. Brian, when I got to Washington, my first job was as an intern for Robert F. Kennedy when he was a senator in the late 60s. And I remember Republicans and Democrats working together. They were good friends. Even the interns and all of the staff worked together, and they were serious about improving the country.
Let's take a question for you from here in the green space. Sir, hello.
How are you? A different topic, if you don't mind, Dr. Reich. I wonder if you subscribe to the notions of the late economist Hyman Minsky, who argued that in the absence of prudential regulation, financial crises like 2008, 1929, whatever, are not just anomalies but inevitabilities. And if so, if you agree with that, does it follow that, the Trump administration is laying the groundwork for yet another crisis?
I do agree largely with that. And I think the Trump administration, not only by deregulating the Dodd-Frank, which in my view was not even adequate to deal with Wall Street and the financial institutions and the betting parlor that finance has become, but to dismantle part of Dodd-Frank and to fill the government up with financial people and lobbyists is begging for another financial crisis. I think that it's almost inevitable.
Ironically, Trump ran on a little bit of populist economics in addition to his race baiting. He ran against Wall Street and the concentration of wealth. He ran against pharmaceutical industry ripoffs. I know it's ironic, right? But he did, if you transcribe his campaign speeches. He ran for no changes to Social Security and Medicare benefits, the opposite of, say, Paul Ryan. And Trump ran on infrastructure here rather than military adventurism abroad. And, of course, he ran on trade protectionism. And all of that was part of Steve Bannonism, too, in addition to the white Christian heteropatriarchal supremacy parts. But Trump seems to have doubled down on the identity politics, but walked away from almost all the economic populism. Does it look that way to you?
Yeah. And remember, 2016 will go down in history as the year that presidential politics became populist in terms of economic populism. And on the right you had, and on the Republican side you had, Donald Trump saying all those things, appealing to a base that was disenfranchised, angry, felt with some justification that they had been ignored and were on a downward escalator and had been for years. And meanwhile, on the left or on the Democratic side, you had the emergence of Bernie Sanders. Nobody expected Bernie Sanders to do well. I mean, he was the most improbable candidate. And before Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump came to prominence, almost every insider in Washington assumed that Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton had it made. But they all overlooked the degree of anger that was welling up in the American populace. Because remember, since 1978-79, wages for most people have gone absolutely nowhere if you adjust for inflation. Almost all the economic gains, and the economy continued to grow almost at the same pace as before, but almost all the economic gains since the late 70s, early 1980s, have gone to the top or near top. And that has meant, the most profound aspect of that degree of inequality has meant that a great deal of wealth, a great deal of money concentrated at the top has been able to change the rules of the game politically, to rig the system for their benefit. So when politicians, and this wasn't just Donald Trump, it wasn't just Bernie Sanders, even Hillary Clinton started talking about the rigging, the deck being stacked in favor of those at the top. When politicians were saying that, they were reflecting what pollsters were telling them, that most Americans really did not trust the system any longer. They didn't trust that the system was going to be delivering for them. If the Democrats don't understand that that is real, that that is what they must address in the midterms and also in 2020, then we're just going to have more and more Donald Trumps forever.
So I'm just curious how much of a protectionist you are as a progressive economics person. Bernie Sanders, who you endorse, ran as one, overlapping with Trump on that point. But I think I see the backlash to Trump provoking a new sort of wistfulness for free trade agreements like NAFTA and the TPP, of all things, among progressives who don't like Trump's obnoxious nationalism and see his withdrawal from trade pacts as a part of that. Where are you on this?
Well, first of all, we've got to understand that the biggest threat to job security is not trade, it's technological change. In fact, artificial intelligence is coming along over the next 5 years. 4.5 million drivers are going to be out of jobs. Many of them truck drivers, many middle-class jobs. We're going to see huge parts of the healthcare industry, which now generates a large number of American jobs, basically denuded of jobs because you're going to have so many artificial intelligence applications of diagnostic software. We've got to be alert to the fact that over the next several decades, about a third to a half of all the jobs we now have will be displaced. That's not trade, that's technology. And there's not enough political discussion of this. I mean, there are things we can do, not only in terms of lifelong education and job training and making our unemployment system into a reemployment system, but we've got to be serious now about widening and enlarging something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a wage subsidy. We've got to have a serious discussion about public sector jobs. We've got to have a serious discussion about something called the universal basic income, for example. I mean, a lot of things we can do, but to just sit and wait for things to fester and people to get angry and insecure, and then the next demagogue to come along and blame foreigners and blame and just indulge in xenophobia is dangerous.
And listeners, in case you're interested in that particular idea, I'll mention that on tomorrow's show, we're going to have one of the Facebook founders, Chris Hughes, who has a new book specifically calling for a guaranteed minimum wage. And we'll talk to him about all kinds of Facebook things, too. But that's where Chris Hughes is going politically these days. For former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich here in the green space, let's take another question from the audience. Hi.
Hi, good morning. My question is twofold. The first part is, why is it that income derived from labor is taxed differently than income derived from assets you already have or interest? And the second part of the question is, has anyone ever done anything? Has there ever been a movement to try to equalize that?
We equalized in 1986. The tax reform of 1986 did treat capital gains income and ordinary income exactly the same. It was it was bipartisan and a great success, to the extent that you can say any tax reform is a success. But deeper down, I think that you've got to understand that when it comes to taxes, the game is really dominated by the inside players, by wealthy individuals and corporations who, whenever they get a chance, not surprisingly, will reduce their own taxes. We have we have a labor force now that is increasingly comprised of people you might call the working poor, people who are working full-time and yet are still poor. That should not be. We shouldn't have anybody who is working full-time and poor. And yet at the same time, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got a number of people, a growing number of people, who are non-working rich. That is, they are not retirees. I'm talking about people who are the recipients of vast inheritances that are never taxed. And we are at the cusp of the largest intergenerational transfer of money in history, $30 trillion from very wealthy baby boomers to their lucky millennial heirs, who will, again, never be working. That's not a healthy society. And we can do something about that. I mean, the Republicans have demagogued the estate tax forever, calling it a death tax. I mean, even now, even before the tax law that went into effect January 1st, the estate tax was only hitting a very tiny 0.2% of 1% of the public, and the richest 0.2% of 1%. And we ought to revive a discussion about the estate tax. That Abraham Lincoln started the estate tax. We ought to have a discussion about, why is it that once an estate is passed on to heirs, all the capital gains in the assets of that estate are forgiven. Essentially, the basis of that estate, and I don't want to get too technical or in too much in the weeds, goes to the next generation without paying any capital gains at all. I mean, why can't we just have an intelligent, practical discussion about what democracy requires in this country?
Before you go, I'm very concerned about the Dreamers. Their protection from deportation expires on March 5th. That's less than 2 weeks from now. And I fear that Trump will start actually deporting them because he seems willing to do almost anything to keep his base inflamed. So while this isn't exactly in your wheelhouse of economics, after the Senate debate fizzled out last week, what do you see as any potential path forward? Have you thought about this?
Yes, I think that there may be a path forward, but every time I think there's a path forward on the Dreamers, it turns out that it is not a path forward, because you're dealing with a president who keeps on changing his mind and who blocks a lot of the reforms that people, even bipartisan, there have been twice already that there have been bipartisan agreements between Republicans and Democrats in the House or Senate, and he has said, well, I'll go along with it, and then he's changed his mind.
Yep.
So in this kind of atmosphere with this kind of leader, I don't know how we can. But let me just say something, Brian, slightly more general about all of this, because you've got a younger generation now. It's not just Dreamers, and I teach Dreamers, by the way, at the University of California, Berkeley. Some of my best students came over as children to the United States. They've known no country other than the United States. But we also have young people who are starting to say, what is going on here? Many of you might have heard Emma Gonzalez, a very articulate young person in Florida at that tragic scene. She spoke Saturday about young people saying, well, let's be real about guns in schools. We've got a lot of young people that I come across who say—
It's not just let's be real. We played part of her speech on yesterday's show. It's we're calling BS. So she's speaking in that very direct language
we're calling BS,
teenagers coming into political consciousness.
But we're also saying, that is teenagers coming into political consciousness, are also saying, adults, what are you doing? You're supposed to be responsible. What are you doing to us? And so what I see, whether we're talking about the deficit or we're talking about tax reform, we're talking about the erosion of democracy, we're talking about partisanship, we're talking about DACA, we're talking about guns in schools, a lot of young people, whenever I get very depressed, I look to the young people and I say, you guys are really smart. You're committed. You are more engaged than any young generation I've ever seen before. And that's true of my students, and it's true of students I lecture to all over the country. They give me hope for the future.
It's amazing how much hope it seems to me that people are taking right now from those students in Parkland, Florida. It's incredible. I want to ask you, as a last question, one other piece of sort of progressive political history leading to where we are now. because immigration, I had brought up the Dreamers, is another area where progressives concerned about labor have flipped over the years. Labor unions used to be skeptical of large-scale immigration because of the supply and demand pressure on wages. Are unions now positioning themselves against their own interests to align themselves so that they can align themselves with other progressive movements?
Well, the AFL-CIO in recent years has changed its position. It is much more welcoming of immigrants.
Exactly.
And I think that most progressives are starting to understand that they're not just a limited number of jobs to go around. Immigrants do generate more jobs because they earn money and they spend money, and their spending generates more jobs on top of that. And if you look at the history of this country, has been generations and generations and more generations of immigrants who have built this country, literally built the country. I mean, the one thing that distinguishes immigrants is actually ambition to get here. Now, this is not all our immigrants. Some were forced here, and some people were here originally. But many immigrants are unique in the sense that they are more ambitious, I think it's fair to say, than native-born people, and they have contributed hugely to this country. And finally, Brian, the only people who have standing to really complain about immigrants are Native Americans.
And on that, we leave it with former Labor Secretary and UC Berkeley Professor Robert Reich. His new book is called The Common Good. And again, if you want to see him in person, he'll be at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side, 2289 Broadway at 82nd, tomorrow night, Wednesday, February 21st at 7 p.m. Secretary Reich, thank you so much for coming to the Green Space.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Brian Lehrer on WNYC will continue in a minute.